Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another Equity in the Center LinkedIn Live. My name is Tanasha Jordan, and I'm joined today by my colleague Whitney Parnell, founder and CEO of Service Never Sleeps. It seems like this is a session at a really right time, considering all of the polarization and division in our country right now that is being particularly stoked along racial lines. So let's get right into it. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today, Whitney. And let's just start with some level setting for folks in the audience. What does it mean to be an ally?
Hi, thank you so much. So wonderful to be with you. We love Equity in the Center. We just feel like we're in such great partnership with you all. So it's always so wonderful to be able to hold space in this way. And we define allyship as an active way of life in one's respective areas of privilege that centers bridge building to pursue social justice for everyone. So there's a mouthful there. I'd say that the main things being that allyship applies to our privilege. So we can all pursue justice and social justice areas, but the part about allyship means that we're doing it from a position of privilege. Um, the two other parts that I like to clarify there are that the bridge building piece, I think a lot of times people think bridge building solely means bridging the divide, but we invite people to think more expansively where white supremacy as a construct is meant to strip all of us of our humanity. So bridge building and disruption of white supremacy involves things like connection and community. So we invite people to think about that expansiveness when it comes to bridge building. And lastly, we really emphasize that allyship applying to our privilege involves responsibility, not a favor or this paternalistic savior offering, right? Like, as a straight cisgender person, I have a responsibility to dismantle homophobia, transphobia, queerphobia. And that's not me like gifting myself in doing so, but rather I am unintentionally complicit in how I can show up in those oppressive structures. And it's my responsibility to not only work to dismantle that externally, but constantly work on myself as well, right? So we really want to emphasize to folks that leveraging your privilege means that there's a responsibility there, not a gifting there. So those are some things that I like to highlight when it comes to allyship.
Thank you so much for that. I love the phrase allyship applies to our privilege because it
Mhm.
makes it sort of plain. Like, an allyship, it sounds like basically in your definition, there's really no way to interpret allyship without bringing the power dynamic into it, right? And that allyship, is a responsibility for power sharing, right? And mitigation of power imbalances.
That's it. That is it. Yep.
Awesome. So going back to the context in which we are considering allyship, as I mentioned at the outset, there is a lot of division in this country, and like broadly, like fomented by folks who want to stoke the differences between a lot of communities and specifically racial ones. And so the result of that in our society has really been sort of a deep entrenchment of us versus them. There's a what we are entitled to versus what other people are entitled to, or who's gotten too much or whatever. And so in that context, it can be hard to sort of see opportunities for allyship. And then also specifically, I think it can be hard for some folks to recognize allyship as a responsibility that they have to people who are different than them, right? So with that in mind, why is it important for white people specifically to listen to people of color on what it takes to be an effective ally?
Oh, thank you so much there. And for that context, if I can respond to that context to lead into that, we often say that our goal here is shared humanity, which we define as a world where we're all embraced for who we are and able to thrive to reach our highest potential. So we operate from this notion of abundance, right? There is enough for all of us here. And white supremacy as a construct in particular sets us up for this scarcity mentality that is literally false. So we often say that allies work towards social justice so that we can achieve this North Star of shared humanity. We're doing this so that collective liberation is here, that we are all living as freely as possible. And so, with that being said, while allyship can apply to all forms of injustice, you have to center race, right? Centering race allows us to work toward everybody's liberation. It causes the most disparities. It's what impacts every major lived experience. And there's data to show that centering race literally with every social justice issue, right, when it comes to intersectionality, literally means that we're working toward all of us being free. And so that's why we have to center race. And so while certainly we emphasize that there is room for all identities in racial justice allyship. When you think of racial solidarity and intersectionality, certainly there is a particular lane where white people with that power dynamic with race have the most responsibility. And so it's just important to understand that context, right? The context of white supremacy, the context of why we have to center race to work toward everybody's liberation. And so within the construct of race, white people have that privilege. And with that being said, when it comes to your actual question around why white people need to center BIPOC folks, basically, is that it's very interesting in these times because I recognize it's an overwhelming time where so much is going on. And a lot of times, regardless of the times, because this work is necessary all the time, I'll hear folks say, I have no idea what to do. I have no idea what to do. And what my response is actually, there's a lot of information out there about what is being asked of you for effective allyship. So it really just means centering those impacted. BIPOC folks know what we need on individual to interpersonal to institutional to systemic levels. And so I think a problem that is often tied with allyship, bringing that privilege piece, is paternalism, right? And how privilege dispositions us to have society make us believe that in our privilege, we have all the answers. When it's actually the flip, those impacted know what they need. And so I just invite white people to understand that if you just center those impacted, center BIPOC folks, not only does that give you the information that you need about how to proceed, but that also does some of the work of dismantling this paternalistic nature that can often show up in privilege when it comes to thinking that we have the answers.
I really appreciate what you said too, and I think that there's something in there about sort of privilege giving people, one of the privileges that they have, white people have, is the ability to hoard agency, right? And hoard, like, autonomy. So I think it's so hard for some people when you've never had to listen to other people or had to achieve consensus, then it can be hard to recognize that that's something you need to do, right? I think about I, like many of us as people of color, I was once in a job where I've had a racist white supervisor, and I, as that in that community of colleagues of color that sometimes results when we're trying to cope through that kind of supervision. I remember a colleague saying about our boss that they think they're right because nobody else is empowered to disagree with them, right? And it's the kind of thing that stayed with me because it's sort of, well, I have to do this and I have to do that. Like, of course, your default position is thinking about what you have the power to do. You don't even consider your power in that situation, right? And sort of it makes me think about, so how do we get folks to recognize that, like the hoarding of autonomy and the hoarding of agency as a particular privilege that cuts off their ability to listen to different people who are different?
Thank you so much for that. Because what's coming up for me when we do our allyship training, we train through an acronym that I know you'll introduce later, but also the way that we train it is through 3 different prongs. Centering, which I just talked about, you need to center those who are impacted. Influence, which I'll talk about later, and how we can engage others. But the big one that people often do not expect in our trainings, but quite frankly goes hardest, is self-work. And all the stuff around turning mirror on self in terms of how we act and react. And so the fragility stuff, the defensiveness stuff, all that was coming up for me as you were talking, because it almost shows a deeper level of what it means to center. It's not just about actually engaging with folks in marginalized identities, with BIPOC folks, about what they need, but how we react to it. Right? If we have been conditioned to sort of hoard knowledge and believe that we have all the answers, it can be quite a journey for people to actually have to receive and to be told, given instruction, right? And to have to work through themselves that the instruction or information that they received is different from what they thought needed to happen, right? And so I just appreciate you naming that, because it's not just about being proximate to the information. It's actually how folks work through and respond to the information coming to them.
Right. And like to your point as well, there's this, you have to develop those skills. People have to, and
Mm-hmm.
white people specifically, have to develop the skills and the self awareness to understand, right? I like to think of it as a sort of, we may, when we speak, when BIPOC people share our experience, we are sharing, like, how we've been impacted by an injustice, or white supremacy, but then we're also sharing, like, how objectively wrong that is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I think
Mm-hmm.
that what happens is sometimes white people get this response where they feel, we objectively talk about a wrong, how things were wrong, right? And then white people internalize that we are critiquing them personally, right? And it's sort of like, listen, you know what I mean? You've got to do the work yourself to understand why you personally feel indicted, right?
Whew,
You know,
so many stories, friend.
that a thing is objectively horrible and objectively wrong is separate from why you feel indicted, right? And it
Right.
is your responsibility to understand how your particular violent biases and the tiny violences that you choose to ignore in society every day
Mhm.
are what indicts you.
Absolutely. I think it can be so wild to see how activated people can get from us just expressing our experiences. In our training, I talk about fragility being a big privilege barrier and different forms of fragility. With one, I call it taking offense by default when centering marginalized folks. And I talked about how one time I was talking to this white woman about all this harm that I experienced as a Black woman. And out of nowhere, she just exploded on me. And she was like, "It's not fair for you to say that all white people are bad people," which I have never said in my entire life and didn't say then. And she was like, "I'm a really good person." Okay. My best friend is Black. All right. And I was just like, I wasn't even talking about you, but now I am. But your point about how centering can be such a challenge for folks because when speaking systems, it's this double-sided coin almost, right? Where it's like people can feel like they're implicated for us speaking to how systems impact us when we're not even talking about them. But the other side of that coin is if you find yourself getting activated and defensive, does that mean some mirror work needs to happen because you have been complicit in doing those exact things that we're talking about, right?
Right.
So there's something to be said about it.
Right. So, I mean, I want to, well, before we go into the next question, I do have to share, anytime I'm in this kind of conversation, I share the thing that I once heard in a workshop with a friend. We were discussing this very same topic. Um, and she gave the question, what did white supremacy steal from white people? Right. Which is not something
Mhm.
that I had never thought to think of it in that way. Right.
Mhm.
Because when we think about white supremacy, we think about it like, accrued benefits and accrued advantages for white people, but we've never thought about, and I'd never thought about, what white supremacy steals from white people itself. And the answer to that question was, understanding the ability to truly be in community with people who are different than themselves,
Mm.
right? And
Mm.
the positioning of it, like, white supremacy within a deficit frame was something that endures with me. Like, wow, white supremacy has stolen from white people, right? It's well as
Mhm.
well. And I wonder
Mhm.
how many of them think about or recognize that. Um,
Certainly. Your point, like, it comes back to the point around collective liberation, right? Like, we all benefit from dismantling these systems, even folks who hold these positions of privilege. So, while privilege means that there's responsibility and work to do, at the end of the day, we are going to benefit from liberation for everybody, for sure.
Absolutely. So
Hmm.
yeah, stemming from that, let's get right into the tactical parts of this. So as I mentioned before, as you mentioned rather, there is an acronym claim, right?
Yeah.
That
Yes.
that you utilize in your work to demonstrate or delineate some effective allyship techniques. Can you
Mhm.
tell me more about that?
Absolutely. And we've just learned that, there's always learning and growing to do. You can never go too deeply into this. In fact, the deeper you go, the deeper you have to get. But we've also learned that having frameworks and acronyms and stuff can plant seeds for the lifestyle and lifetime ahead of this work. And that's why we have this acronym. So the CLAIM acronym is care, learn, act, influence, and maintain. Our training goes into this a whole lot more. But as a snapshot, I'll say that care means that we take issue with injustice, that we want shared humanity achieved. And also, what does a posture of care look like? I think sometimes folks can be thinking so broadly and so high level about these issues that, one, they freeze, but two, they neglect that one of the most effective ways to show up in allyship is our interpersonal engagement with people around us. And so what does it mean to have a posture of actual support and care toward the individuals around us who are impacted by these systems? Next, we have learn, and that means, like we were talking about with centering, right? Centering those impacted, doing what we can to inform ourselves about these issues. And what I also often offer is that allyship, white allies, it has to be their responsibility to take the effort of learning, because a lot of times what folks would be like is they'll go to BIPOC folks and say, I want to be a better ally, tell me everything about what I need to do. And that just dispositions BIPOC folks to have to exhaust ourselves to teach. And so I always tell white folks, you got to be the one to take on the labor for how you pursue your knowledge, and that when a BIPOC person shares with you, receive that as a gift, not something that is owed. Next is act. And that's like applying the caring and the learning to what I like to say, what we do and don't do. We just spoke very briefly about how fragility can show up as so much harm and everything. And so I think it's important for people to understand allyship isn't just about what we start doing, but we need to see allyship as preventative work. And I often offer people to conceptualize, if everybody in their privilege stopped doing the harmful things themselves, there would be a palpable shift in society. So I always invite people to think about their actions in terms of preventative as well, and preventing the harm that can come from them, not just about doing the thing all around. Next, we have influence. And I'll say this, I'll say a lot of people come to our trainings wanting solely to learn the influence tools, wanting to learn how to talk to everybody else around them. They're like, I need to learn how to talk to my racist family and friends. They're terrible. And then they show up the most problematically in the trainings themselves because they have not done that mirror work. So I want to name that is a lot of what comes to our training. So they get kind of a rude awakening when most of the training is about turning the mirror on selves. The other side of that, though, is that I'll say more broadly, I think a lot of times people think that allyship ends with the class. If I care about these issues, if I do as much as I can to learn and inform myself, then that will impact how I act. And that's all that can be asked of me. And we're always like, nah, influence is critical, where there's a power in how we can not only take on the labor of engaging in difficult conversations, how white people talking to other white people can take on that labor so that BIPOC folks don't have to do it. Also, that sameness bias is real. I'm wondering if you can relate, doing this work, how often I'm a Black woman who trains in racial justice, how often I've said something and a white person will be like, that's not true. And then another white person will be like, it is true. And they'll be like, oh, thank you. There is a sameness bias there that people should use in their privilege because it's a way to reach folks in ways that I can't because of that bias. So influence is so critical. And I always joke that the holiday season is when so many people are reaching out like, please help me for this holiday dinner table. The people always say some stuff, so I need to be ready. And I always say, look, it's good to be ready for those moments. And also, there are opportunities to engage in influence every single day, not just out at the holiday dinner table. So how do we show up to it? And then the last is maintaining, which is what I really want to emphasize, especially in these times where we care, learn, act, influence. This is what we maintain. This is the lifestyle, right? Like, so a lot of times people will say, if I can just get the allyship checklist, to which I'm like, there's no allyship checklist, it's a lifestyle, then I'm good, then it's easy, to which I'm like, nah. This should be exhausting, difficult, challenging, something from the inside out that we literally live out. It should be a constant way of being. And if I can go there, I'll just close out that CLAIM acronym by saying that in 2020, so many people and institutions claimed a deep commitment to racial justice work when the Black Lives Matter uprising started after the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, just to name a few. And I remember in moments of exhaustion when I would say to people, let's see in 2 years. Let's see in 2 years if this commitment is still here. And like clockwork, like clockwork, we started seeing how things started changing in 2 years. And now look at where we are. And so what I'll emphasize is maintaining is the work beyond when it's in the headline and beyond when it's trendy, to put out the statement, to make the commitment, to take the selfie at the protest, to put up the social media post. Maintaining is the work when it requires courage and risk as well.
Yeah.
And so I just say people have to ask themselves in this time right here, what does maintaining look like for you? And then people get really mad at me when I say all that, but
No,
it has
it's
to be
real.
said.
And at the
Mhm.
same time, to the point, if it feels comfortable, you're probably not doing it right. I remember
Exactly.
in 2020, I was doing the work of compiling and analyzing philanthropic data, much of it
Mhm.
about that time period. And it was startling 2 years later to see how many, vocal, philanthropic commitments did not materialize, to the point
Mhm.
of people getting caught up in the, it should be the thing that we are saying, but then not
Mhm.
following through on that commitment.
Mhm.
I definitely
Mhm.
did want to comment on the sameness bias, because it is a thing. It is a thing that we experience, particularly sort of. It's a thing that you kind of sort of try to deal with, and it forces me to comport myself appropriately, i.e., fix my
Mhm.
face. But why do you come to the training that is led by BIPOC people, where BIPOC people have, like, opted to do the extraordinary emotional labor of sharing our lived experience, to say, well, not all white people, or well, we'll not like that. And
Mhm.
then, like, sure enough, there's that white person that once says, well, no, I've experienced this. And they're like, oh, well, I suppose it does. You know what I mean? Oh, I suppose that does have
Mhm.
merit, now that someone else has done it.
Mhm.
And sort of just that the
Mhm.
irony escapes these people has something, I mean, let's say it's poignant, in that moment. But I do definitely wanted to talk more about maintenance, because I don't know if you've come across this or experienced this,
Mhm.
especially when working with white people. There's an imperative to sort of, I think that everybody knows, and people who are at least inclined towards this work know that the work of pursuing our collective liberation and dismantling so much systemic oppression is the work of lifetimes, plural, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so the understanding, or sitting there and reflecting on the enormity of that, I have seen some white people sort of act to sort of shrink the challenge down to what they can do,
Mhm.
or like the least I can do, or like, thinking about their contribution to pursuing our liberation as finite, or as with limitations,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Well, I can do this, and well, that's my contribution, or I'll stop there, right? um
Mhm.
and so
Mhm.
how, I think about, like, how we can, like, sort of help people understand that allyship is an ongoing, it's a verb, you know what I
Mhm.
mean? The work of
Mhm.
allyship requires maintenance and is ongoing.
Mhm.
Can we talk about that a little bit more, about how we help white people counter this idea of a finite contribution to our liberation?
Thank you so much for that. And that's why, as much as possible, we say allyship as opposed to allies. We're granted, grammatically, sometimes we say allies, but we say we train in allyship, not we train allies, right? For exactly that reason, that it's a posture, a way of showing up, and that we say that it's forever work. And so, what I'll say to that is, I'm an activist, right? And organize a lot. And a lot of my Black and Brown activist siblings don't even like the term ally. They want
A
co-conspirator,
conspirator.
accomplice, being all in. Because the term ally is turned kind of wishy-washy. It's turned into, I'm an ally, but I want to stay comfortable. I'm an ally, but I'm not doing that. I'm an ally, but I'm mad at you, so I'm not doing this anymore. I've gotten that before. One time in a training, someone literally said to me, literally, I can't make this stuff up, that they came into the training as a passive ally, but because they didn't like my angry and aggressive tone, which is so racist to say to a Black woman, by the way, now they're going to
Completely.
be passive opponents. And I was just like, can you be mad at me, but not commit to being racist because you're mad at me? Like, can you separate the two things? I was like, you have to like me, but don't say that now you're going to be racist because you don't like me, right? Like, right,
Yeah,
the
I don't
story.
understand
So,
also how
look,
someone can be a passive opponent. The
right,
opponent negates
look,
the
yeah.
passive.
Right, right. And so there's reason for BIPOC folks in particular not to trust the term ally because it's turned so fair weather. And so we always say, how do you see allyship? Is synonymous with accomplice, co-conspirator, being all in. But I actually think that point is such an important thing to emphasize when it comes to allyship and our privilege, is that we can always leave at any point. That's what privilege allows us, right? I often invite people to think of allyship work like one of those moving ramps at the airport that's going backwards, or an escalator that's going down. That's these systems, right? That is systemic oppression. That is racism. Must we be reminded in these times? It's this energy constantly trying to take us backward that we're going to have to work against so much harder to pursue that North Star of shared humanity. And if I may, white people can leave that symbolic moving platform at any point. And furthermore, when they stop, they're going backwards. And so I think that's actually a really important thing to emphasize, is that privilege allows for stopping, which is why there has to be the active commitment every day to the work.
Yes. Privilege allows people to get off of the ride,
Mm-hmm.
and privilege allows people to participate at their level of comfort, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
think that,
Mm-hmm.
as we've seen, people have co opted the word ally, what I mean, to be an indicator of their level of comfort, right? I
Mm-hmm.
am willing to participate here. Not necessarily, I mean, the difference is, seeing yourself and your life as intertwined. Our fates are
Mm-hmm.
intertwined with each other. So
Mm-hmm.
what makes allyship, or helps people understand allyship as something to be maintained, right? Because my
Mm-hmm.
life and my liberation is bound to yours, right? I
Mm-hmm.
work to improve conditions for us both. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so, in our last couple of minutes, I would love to hear you talk more about the session. It's a two-part session, Intersectional Allyship for White Allies, happening September 2nd and 3rd.
Yeah.
What more can you tell us about what will be covered, and what the format of the sessions will be like?
Awesome. Well, first, I just want to celebrate Equity in the Center and the opportunity that we have to do this training in partnership with you all, because in full transparency, most of our trainings are done when organizations hire us to do trainings for their employees. And so Equity in the Center is just demonstrating so much generosity by bringing us here to open this up to anybody to be able to sign up as individuals. So I just want to express gratitude for the opportunity that you're creating for this to get as far and wide as possible. And people often say that our trainings are like drinking from a fire hose, to which I say, well, you're going to leave hydrated. Don't want to be hydrated here. And so we like to say that it's a
Agreed.
fast paced training that really establishes what allyship means. It helps ground people in where they have a responsibility to be allies within the framing of racial justice. So we center race here. And then we teach the tools of the CLAIM acronym: care, learn, act, influence, maintain, in that training through those 3 blocks of centering, working on self, and influencing others. So we like to say that it's like a seed planted, where all the information that you're going to get and all the time to have breakout rooms and practice and stuff is all in there, but it's never going to be enough time, because speaking to that lifetime aspect of everything, that forever work aspect of everything, it's all seeds planted for the continued symbolic growth, for the processing, learning, dialoguing, implementation, action to take place post training. So I will just say it warms my heart to hear from people that take this training, that a lot of times they go to trainings hearing about the issue but not quite knowing what to do afterwards, and that this feels like a training that really sets people up with the empowerment, tools, and accountability to do moving forward.
That's really, really exciting. That's amazing. Um, oh, well, Whitney, this has been really, really amazing. I'm gonna, for folks who are watching, live or in the recording, I'm going to post the link to the Eventbrite page where you can purchase tickets for the session, in the comments. And once again, Whitney, I can't wait to talk to you again.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for taking time to go over this with us today.
Wonderful. So wonderful to speak with you. And again, so grateful for the amazing organization that Equity in the Center is. So be well, my friend.
Be well too, and thank you.
All right. Bye.